Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I'm going to tackle the constitutional question. I don't know about you, but Scottish politics at the moment just seems like Groundhog Day. You go to a newspaper website and what's the story? The lead story will often be Nicola Sturgeon says there should be an independence referendum. Someone or other says, no, there shouldn't. Someone says they've got a mandate. Someone says they haven't got a mandate. And just goes round in circles. It's as though they've run out of arguments to put forward and they're just repeating the same lines over and over and over again in the hope that eventually somehow that's going to persuade people. It's deadlock. And it's also boring. When was the last time you heard something new and fresh said about the Constitution instead of just like hammering away the same old points again and again and again and again and again? Very possibly quite some time. So what I'm going to try and do in this video is to present some fresh perspectives, to go back to basics a little bit and to think the whole thing through from the beginning again. Well, there's no secret about it where I stand on the issue. I'm a unionist. I've debated defending that position in the past. What's the Scottish Family Party's position? The Scottish Family Party is neutral. This video will include some arguments that I would say are arguments I personally find persuasive, but not necessarily family party policy. So what I'm trying to do here is to take a step back and to look at the issue in a broader context. Now, if you're thinking, I'm really wound up here, he'd better not say anything that strengthens the nationalist cause, or he'd better not say anything that makes it seem like he's saying that unionism is the right thing. Okay, if you're thinking like that, now I was thinking of saying at this point, please don't watch the video, go and watch something else instead. But that would be a foolish thing to say, because I would like you to watch the video, because what I'm going to try to do is diffuse the issue to some extent and to try and encourage a broader perspective. So stay with it. So I said I'm going to start back at the basics. What are the basics? Well, I want to start off by defining a nation and a state. Now, the definitions I'm going to give here, I think roughly speaking, they're accepted in academic circles, but in everyday use, these terms are used interchangeably and quite in a confusing way as well. So, for example, a state in the United States of America isn't a state by my definition. So I would encourage you to really focus on my definitions of these terms and then apply those through the rest of the video. Right, so what is a nation? I would say a nation is a group of people sharing a sense of identity that's been formed through common territory, through common history, common culture, common religion, common language, a combination of those things. Okay? Now that people group identifying together as a nation may or may not be a state. That's a different thing. So what's a state? A state is a territory that's governed from within itself. And ideally within a state, there would be solidarity among the people. There would be a common identity. There would be a spirit of cooperation, a spirit of provision for each other, of making sacrifices for each other. So you pay your taxes in one part of the state, and if that's spent providing healthcare for someone in a different part of the state, then that's perfectly fine. That's the ideal within a state, that the people within it are seeking the common good, not just the good of their little section of the state, but the good of the whole state. So when it comes to defending the state against external threats, then the state would act as one. So within a state, people would see their compatriots as our people. In a sense, that's us as opposed to them, the people in other states. And I would say that's largely a good thing. I think universalism in terms of like human compassion and altruism doesn't work in practice. It tends to be too weak and diffused. That's one of the reasons why the human rights ethos has got some problems, because it tries to overcome the sense of looking after people within your own state and saying instead that you should have the same responsibilities as everyone in the world. Everyone's got the same rights. Now, obviously, there's a lot in that, but there is another side of the coin as well. Because in order to express compassion, to make sacrifices for each other, this sense of connection is very important. It's just part of human nature. You might wish that wasn't the case, but I think it's a fact that it is. We see it with families. Families focus resources, love, attention, care on family members at the expense of, to some extent, of the rest of the people in the world. Is that a bad thing? No, it's a good thing, because that means that people get the care and attention they deserve. Where there's people that need some extra help, then what the families have got left over, one would hope, would be shared in order to help them as well. So within a state, you would hope that people feel a common bond and they're willing to make sacrifices for each other. And part of the reason for that is the feeling of reciprocity. So, for example, in Britain, if someone is ill and they can't work, I'm happy for my taxes to provide for that person. Because if I was ill and I couldn't work, their taxes would provide for me. You know, that's the deal we've got in a state. Trying to implement that worldwide, I'm not sure that's possible by a long shot at the moment. But within a nation, you can create that sense of mutual responsibility and support. So I feel a special responsibility towards compatriots. And some people might say, oh, no, that's really wrong. Everyone's equally valuable. Yes, everyone's equally valuable, but I'm not sure anyone actually takes that into their politics. I mean, does anyone say the National Health Service budget, it shouldn't just be spent in Scotland, we should distribute it evenly around the world to wherever the need is? Because that would be fair. We'd be treating everyone equally. Would anyone really want to do that? Would any political party put that forward? Now, even if you think that's the way it should be like, then it's not human nature. You're going to have a real uphill struggle persuading people to do that. Whereas if you take a smaller group, a nation who identify with each other, then people can be induced to enter into these sort of mutually cooperative and supportive relationships, which I think is a really good thing. So that's a state, a territory governed from within itself. Now, you could say the ideal would seem to be that the state, the objective state, aligns with people's subjective sense of nationhood. And then these characteristics that create a successful state, this common identity, would be at its strongest, and that would be the ideal. Now, there are a few other sides of the argument with this. For example, if that resulted in a patchwork of small nations instead of larger nations, well, that can have its downsides. For example, they're more vulnerable to aggressors. I mean, let's say, ridiculously hypothetical example, but let's say, for example, Great Britain, instead of being a single state, was, say, 6 smaller states at the start of the Second World War. What would have happened? Would they have been able to defend themselves and to take the war to the Nazis? I would suggest not. Probably Hitler would have won the Second World War. So I think that's an important point, vulnerability of small nations. If nations divide into a patchwork of small states, they become vulnerable to strong aggressors. Another problem with having a lot of small states is it becomes inefficient. Duplication of government functions and just friction of dealing across state boundaries repeatedly. So another way of looking at things is to say it's good to have bigger states and then to forge a sense of national identity. Even though the people within it might start with diverse national identities, you can try and forge something united out of it. And then that's the ongoing process in the United States of America. Well, I say it was the ongoing process. I think maybe in recent, maybe the recent decade, maybe that hasn't been the agenda so much, but that's a whole different topic. But that's another approach to try and forge national identity across larger states. Now, nationalism in general is the philosophy that every nation should aspire to become a state. Now, I suggest that philosophy stated like that is quite simplistic. For example, let's say you've got a state that includes different national groups within it. Now, Scottish nationalists would argue that's the situation with the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a state, but there's a nation within it called Scotland, and so therefore that should become its own state so that state and nation align perfectly. So Scotland should secede. But there's a problem with that philosophy. Well, there are a few problems. One of the problems is what's called the Russian doll problem. You know, a Russian doll where you open it and then you find a smaller version inside, smaller version inside, smaller version inside. Because if a state secedes in order to satisfy people's sense of subjective national identity, you might solve one problem, but then you find within it, you've created a new one. Then you solve that problem and you find within it you've created another one. So, for example, were Scotland to be independent, people are already suggesting if that were to happen, then the Scottish borders should be able to have a referendum and decide to stay part of the UK. Or Orkney or Shetland should be able to come part of Norway or whatever. So let's say Scotland became independent. There was a lot of unhappiness in the borders, say. So people decided, right, okay, what would be better? Because 60% of people in the borders want to be still be part of the United Kingdom, we'll let them have a referendum, then they can choose their own future. And let's say they decide to stay in the UK. You've then got 40% of the people in the borders who are really unhappy. They say, no, we wanted to be part of the new Scotland. They might say, look, we live in Hawick. 60% of people in Hawick want to be part of the new Scotland. We want a referendum to join it. Then they have their referendum, and let's say Hawick becomes part of the independent Scotland. But then there's 40% of the people in Hawick who are saying, this is not what we want. We wanted to be part of the United Kingdom, especially our section of Hawick, our suburb. And you see, ad infinitum. It just goes on and on. So you solve one problem, you create other ones. And as the process goes on, it tends to become more and more embittered, often towards conflict, overt conflict and violence. Northern Ireland is a classic case of that. Ireland, the whole of Ireland, wanted independence overall. So they were given it. Part of Ireland didn't want it. They wanted to stay part of Britain. So they were given that. Some of the people within Northern Ireland wanted to be part of the United Ireland. And then you end up, wars down the middle of Belfast, etc. So it really is playing with fire. National identity is a very powerful force in people's lives. It should not be underestimated either way. So I think there's grounds for caution in making changes like that. Right, that's the secession route to nation aligning with state. The other route, of course, is to unite. If you've got a nation of people that's actually divided into separate states, then a nationalist could say we should unite. So all these Slavic nations should come together to form one great Slavic state called Yugoslavia. For example, that's the other way of looking at it. But the same problem emerges. The Russian doll problem applies again. Now, things get quite complicated when we look at the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom clearly is a state. I would say, especially since we've left the EU. A state within the EU, are they governed from within the territory entirely? Well, that's a bit debatable, but we won't go into that area. But the UK outside of the EU is very definitely, clearly, indisputably a state. Scotland also, I would say indisputably, is a nation in the sense that I defined it, and Scotland is not a state. But it's not that simple, because the United Kingdom is also a nation as I've defined it, because people have a common language, culture, history, sense of identity, and very strong in a lot of cases. So the United Kingdom is also a single nation in some ways as well. Is Scotland also a state? Well, it's sort of on its way towards being a state. It's got a lot of aspects of statehood in terms of its own parliament, its own government. So it's a bit of a hybrid there as well. Now, those questions I'm raising there, they can't be settled by the terminology. Just the fact that it gets called this, therefore it must be such and such a thing. I'm talking about my definitions of a nation and a state. So in the UK, it's quite a complex picture. So going back to the nationalist philosophy, nation and state should align. Every nation should be its own state. So therefore, secession is argued for in many cases. There are secession movements in various places around the world currently, including Scotland in the UK. And I would say in general, there are two good reasons for a state seceding from a larger state, a nation seceding from a larger state. The first reason is this. If there's some sort of injustice, it could be, for example, the state invaded this territory like 20 years ago, completely unprovoked and unwanted, and it just wasn't fair, and people want to get their country back. I mean, that's pretty clear cut, isn't it? Now, if that happened like 500 years ago, well, all national boundaries have been fluid. I mean, everyone's invaded everyone, and if you try to go back too far in history, it just ends up completely all over the place. But if it's something recent, then that could be an injustice that needs to be put right. Other injustices that are claimed for Scottish independence. It used to be a big thing. England takes our oil. The UK takes Scottish oil and spends it, spends our money. So it's sort of been stolen. Was that really an injustice? I really don't think so. I think if oil had been discovered, mainly off the coast of Norfolk, I don't think we'd have had Scottish nationalists saying, no, don't spend that money in Scotland. That's English oil, you keep it down there. So I really don't think there was an injustice. Things like the poll tax were presented as this is an injustice inflicted on Scotland. But the poll tax was implemented over the whole of Britain. Okay, it might have been earlier in Scotland, but that was a Britain-wide policy. I mean, more recently, we had this border force raid on a couple of suspected illegal immigrants in Glasgow. And that was played by some Scottish nationalists as an example of an injustice. The UK government interfering and being unfair, treating Scottish people unfairly one way or another. But really, these are just common or garden political issues. If that border raid had taken place in Birmingham, there similarly would have been people from a similar part of the political spectrum saying this is outrageous, this shouldn't be happening. But in Scotland, it gets played as a nationalist injustice, I feel, unfairly. Another injustice that's put forward sometimes by Scottish nationalists is basically we keep getting Conservative governments, but we don't vote for them. Now again, is that really an injustice? I mean, is that not just part of living in a democracy? The territory that you live in might vote one way, but you don't always get that government. I mean, for example, if you lived in Manchester, say, people in Manchester probably overall vote Labour repeatedly, and half the time they get Conservative governments. I mean, is that some injustice inflicted on the people of Manchester? I really don't think it is. Real injustices would be less democratic rights, like you don't get a vote if you live in Scotland, or some sort of real discrimination against Scottish people, like you can't get a job working for the government if you're Scottish. Or if Scottish taxes were taken to the central exchequer and then clearly unfairly a small proportion of them was sent back and the money was directed to other parts of the United Kingdom, that would be an injustice that would justify secession. So in my opinion, these injustices that are cited, they don't really exist. Injustice isn't a reason for Scottish independence, in my view. Now, quite often when Scottish nationalists present arguments in this form, basically they're circular. They go like this. The argument goes, Scotland should be an independent country. Right, next point. Scotland is currently not treated as an independent country with regard to issue X. Therefore, that's unfair, because Scotland should be an independent country. Therefore, Scotland should be an independent country. Now, obviously, you will see the premise and the conclusion are the same. But if you're aware of this argument, you'll see it reproduced time and time and time again by Scottish nationalists. And it can sound something like this. Scotland should be an independent country. Scotland is currently not treated as an independent country with regard to the election of the Westminster government. Okay, we don't just get what Scotland votes for, we get what the UK votes for. That's not fair, because Scotland should be an independent country. Therefore, that's an argument why Scotland should be an independent country. It's completely contentless. Or alternatively, Scotland should be an independent country. Scotland was not treated as an independent country with regard to the EU referendum. That's unfair, because Scotland should be treated as an independent country. Therefore, Scotland should be an independent country. I mean, you lay it out that clearly, and to my mind, in any case, you can see that there's just nothing there. There's no logic there. But it just gets trotted out again and again and again. Right, the second valid view for secession is where the majority of the population want it. Now, I think in the referendum in 2014 and the run-up to it and the referendum itself, it was clear that that wasn't the case. The majority did not want Scottish independence. Is it the case now? Well, that's a bit more debatable. I would say on balance it probably isn't, but it's pretty finely balanced. It's on a knife edge. And that does lead me to the conclusion that actually a single referendum to decide the issue is inadequate. Maybe something like getting more than 50% of the electorate, not of the voters, of the whole electorate voting for Scottish independence. Or maybe over 60% of the vote might be more applicable to such a momentous decision. Because something like Scottish independence is irreversible, and the consequences are so wide-ranging and deep that it should be treated differently. I mean, lots of organisations will have a different standard for changing the constitution than they will for making everyday decisions. I think it's quite clear why that's the case. Now, you could say, what about the EU referendum? Should that have been more than just a single referendum? Well, I would say there could be a case made that it should have been more than just a single referendum, just needing a simple majority. Having said that, I would say the decision to leave the European Union is not as serious and fundamental as Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. So my personal view with a referendum is it shouldn't be held until the settled will of the people is clear. In other words, there's been a clear majority in favour of Scottish independence over a substantial period of time. That's the time to have a referendum. So I think that's open to the will of the people, but I think it is recognising as well the scale of the decision. Now, it could be that in 10 years' time, maybe it will be clear that, for example, for the last 5 years, there has been a clear and growing majority in favour of Scottish independence. Now, if we're in that situation, I would certainly support a Scottish independence referendum. But I don't support the idea of, can we please have another roll of the dice? Can we just keep rolling it until we might just about get over the border? If the referendum happened to be 1 week, we might win. Maybe if we try again the next year, maybe just the opinion polls might have just gone the other way slightly. Maybe we'll get it that time instead. I don't think that's the right approach for such an important decision. People who are taking that approach, please come. We just want another roll of the dice. We want to keep trying and trying and trying. If we get 50.1%, then that's great, we've won. I'll say to those people, is that really the route to taking the nation forward in a united manner with a new vision of its future? Or is that just a way to get what you want? I would suggest possibly the latter. There are also two bad reasons, I think, that can be put forward for secession as well. One is, if we broke off from the rest of the country, we'd be richer. We've got more money than them, so we would be a wealthier nation. I mean, you state it that, it's just obviously a selfish argument, isn't it? But what often happens around the world, where you get a secession campaign, it starts with flag waving and national identity, but before too long, the argument moves to who's going to have more money. Can we afford this, and are we going to be wealthier? And to some extent, I think that's where the Scottish independence campaign has tended to move towards as well. But then the idea that you break off because you're wealthier is selfish. If you imagine that within a nation, I mean, let's say Edinburgh, I would imagine Edinburgh is possibly the wealthiest city in Scotland. If people said, right, we want Edinburgh to be a city-state, if we did that, we're just going to be far wealthier than the rest of the country. So we don't want to be sharing our resources with Glasgow and Dundee and all those places. We want to keep Edinburgh's wealth in Edinburgh so we can be richer, and then, well, that's their problem. And that's not a particularly admirable argument, is it? Bad reason number two that's put forward is Scotland's got a different political outlook from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, again, that's not an argument for secession. If you drew a line across the United Kingdom anywhere in any direction, the average political view on one side of the line would be slightly different from the average political views on the other side of the line. And that's true of the Scottish border, inevitably. But that's not a reason for secession. I say, like, the politics of the north of England and the south of England might be significantly different, but it doesn't lead to any secession movement. It's the subjective sense of national identity that is actually the crucial thing. So I think being wealthier and the different political outlook, I don't think they're good arguments at all for secession. So what does really drive nationalist secession movements? What really drives it is a subjective sense of national identity. It's about us and them. Now, as I explained earlier, I'm not saying that the us and them mentality is a bad thing, which some people seem to think. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying it's a subjective thing. So, when Scottish nationalists talk about we, they're talking about we the people of Scotland. When Unionists talk about we, they're more likely to be talking about we the people of the United Kingdom, we the people of Great Britain. Right, so, which is right or wrong? How do you persuade someone to change this subjective sense of identity? Well, it's not something you can really argue about rationally because it is subjective. So, say at the beginning, I'm a Unionist. Obviously, a lot of people in Scotland are Unionists. Why did they end up being Unionists? Is it in the genes? Well, no, I don't think it is. It's people's experience and it's people's upbringing is a very significant part. Their education. For example, the royal family is quite a powerful symbol of UK identity. I think the way people are introduced through their upbringing to the royal family might be quite a significant factor whether they become Unionists or nationalists. So if your family, watches the Queen's speech avidly every Christmas Day, then that communicates to the family that this is something important, something that we respect. And that would probably lean people towards Unionism. Whereas another family, when the Queen's speech comes on and that family says, oh, a lot of rubbish, turn this off, let's get some film on or something, then I would say in that family, people are more likely to become nationalists. Now, also looking at history as well, depends on the way history is taught and the way people become aware of it. It might be that people learn about Scottish history in a way that emphasises the difference and the distinct Scottish national identity. And maybe other people, when they look at history, they see more to be proud of and more commonality in British history. Which is right, which is wrong? Well, it's not a matter of right or wrong, it's just a matter of emphasis and focus. The armed forces can be a focus of national identity in all countries. It's quite difficult to explain why that is. I could try, we'll maybe save that for another day, but it's a fact that they are. So for some people, the emotional appeal of seeing the British armed forces will draw them towards unionism. For other people, that has it might even repel them and might push them a little bit towards nationalism. Through entertainment, art, films, etc., that can have a lot of influence. But when I was younger, I would watch a lot of war films. And in those war films, the British, the English, the Scots and the Welsh, they were certainly one team together, along with the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and they were definitely the goodies, and they were fighting against evil. So through my upbringing, that sort of diffused into me this idea that Britain was united and it's got a history of fighting the baddies, if you like. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, and that will draw people towards unionism. Whereas maybe today young people are growing up more with Iron Man and the Hulk have a fight with who knows who. So that doesn't lead them into any particular national identity. If you look at American films, very commonly they're promoting American patriotism, which often in Britain people see it and mock it. I think it seems a bit ridiculous. On the other hand, you could see that as a country that knows what it's trying to do. It is trying to forge this sense of common identity in order to avoid the sort of situations we've got in the UK where there isn't a sense of common identity and the fragmentation is on the cards. Sport, very important aspect, national identity as well. So if you're supporting British teams, British athletes, sportsmen, women in various contexts, that can contribute to a sense of patriotism and national identity. That can lead people into unionism. Obviously in Scotland as well, it could also lead people into nationalism with the Scottish football team, Scottish rugby team, etc. Things like the national anthem as well. I say, if that's something that becomes associated with national pride, these things can be powerful effects on people's emotions. That's why they exist. Again, it might be difficult to explain why rationally, but they do have a strong influence on people. And also shared culture, travel, common family across the border, all these things can lead people in a unionist direction. Also, looking at history in the longer term, a common enemy has also strengthened Unionism as well. Generally, I understand that over the last 3 centuries of the Union, Scottish nationalism has tended to get stronger in eras of protracted peacetime. Whereas if you have a world war, a major conflict, where there's a sense of threat and everyone pulling together to resist this external threat, then Scottish nationalism tends to go on to the back foot. Now, symbols like flags, anthems, I mean, they do tend to get demeaned in our society. A lot of people laugh at them, think it's all a bit ridiculous. But then these same people who would do that about national symbols, when the EU issue came up, then with people waving flags and having anthems, etc., related to the EU. So I think it's pretty broadly recognised that these are powerful factors in national identity. But another factor as well that might lead people to unionism is a sense of gratitude of the provision that the state has made to them. As I was saying, the National Health Service benefits, the fact that the nation is defended, it's stable, there's law and order. These things are something that the state has provided to us, and in the past, people in Scotland would have been grateful to a large extent to the UK government for providing these things for them. Since devolution, that's been diluted quite significantly, and people are now more likely to think the healthcare, law and order, etc., they're actually provided just by Scotland, so they don't feel a sense of connection to the United Kingdom through those things. Right, on the other hand, what subjective factors might lead someone towards Scottish nationalism? Well, if you're brought up in a context or you arrive at your own opinions where there's real hostility to the Tories, this was really strong in the 80s, maybe 90s as well, to Margaret Thatcher, then that could have a real powerful impact on people. If the more the UK government is demonised, the more people will feel, that this is alien to us. It's part of a different people group, if you like. Another factor in Scottish nationalism, I think it's just a fact, is a degree of anti-English feeling. I'm not overplaying that. I'm not saying it's by any means all Scottish nationalists or even a majority. But on the other hand, it is definitely real. I mean, repeatedly, I would always say routinely, I get messages along the lines of, go home, you're English. What are you doing in Scottish politics? You're English. Why should we listen to you? So that's a significant factor which will obviously lead people towards Scottish nationalism. I said about sport, culture, language, history, all of those things as well can move people more into alignment with Scottish nationalism. I say with Scottish sporting teams, football and rugby. Scottish culture is very strong in lots of ways. The Gaelic language, again, you can see why the SNP is pushing it, but there is that distinction. History as well. There's an awful lot of history where Scottish history is very distinct from British history, from English history, Welsh history. But more recent history has been intertwined and combined to a large extent. Which aspect you focus on? Who's to say which is the most important part? I think another factor with Scottish nationalist tendency has been a lack of reinforcement of British identity over decades. I think generally Britain's sense of confidence and its ability to project a positive identity of itself on its own population has been diminished. So I think that's contributed to a rise in Scottish nationalism as well. And again, just the converse of the things I said leads people towards unionism. Maybe people who haven't interacted much with English people in particular, haven't been to England much, they haven't got family in England, their lives very much been focused in Scotland. That might make people more likely to be Scottish nationalists. Now, these issues, I'm talking about them in a person's experiences, but they can be traced back through centuries. Like a person's family will influence them, but that family, the adults will be influenced by the previous generation, So these things go back centuries. And it's interesting that when the Union took place, 1707, there was never complete assimilation. So 300 years, and the United Kingdom never became a unitary state, if you like. So why didn't that happen? And the reason it didn't happen is simply that Scottish national identity was too strong and is too strong to allow that to happen. And I think that's a really important point. I mean, maybe hearing a lot of what I've said, you've maybe been thinking, oh, that's on the unionist side, it's on the unionist side. But you see this as tipping the scales the other way a little bit. I think both sides have got to recognise the strength of feeling on the other side. Scottish nationalism wouldn't have got anywhere unless there was this strong sense of identity, of nationhood among the Scottish people. You've got to concede that. On the other hand, Scottish nationalism would have won. They would have won the referendum last time. It would have happened years and years ago if the sense of British identity was insignificant and the Scottish identity was overwhelming. So both are there very strongly. Right, which is right? Which is good? Which is bad? And the answer to that is that there's no answer. There's no answer. These are ultimately matters of subjective feeling of national identity. It's not to do with true or false, right or wrong. It's just a subjective, almost emotional attachment. So I would suggest people who make their mission in life constitutional, to either defend the Union or to achieve Scottish independence, I would suggest that mission actually has no ultimate moral significance, because there's no objective to the answer to the question whether or not unionism or nationalism is the best thing. Now, you can say for sure, if Scotland were to secede, there would be massive disruption. There would be huge expense. But what would it lead to in the longer term? Well, people can project. Ultimately, it's very difficult to know. That's not to say that there can't be good guesses about it. But ultimately, especially as you go further into the future, no one really knows. It's a step into the unknown. On the other hand, staying with the United Kingdom, that's also a step into the unknown to some extent as well. You could argue that being part of a larger state is a bit more stable than being a smaller state. There's that argument. On the other hand, a smaller state can be more nimble in various ways, can take advantage of that situation. But basically, it's the unknown. Now, we're hearing repeatedly at the moment that people of Scotland have got the right to decide their future. In other words, there should be another independence referendum. And nationalists are saying that as though that, again, that's a fundamental moral principle. The people have got the right to decide, therefore there should be an independence referendum next year or the year after. But it's not a fundamental moral principle. The people have got the right to decide. What, every week, every month, every year, every decade, every generation? Once a century? You see, the extremes there are obviously wrong, but where's the right point in the middle? That's obviously open to debate. And it's a debate where really what principles are there to be brought to bear. I think what overwhelms the debate is people just wanting to have their own way. Unionists not wanting to have a referendum ever in order to secure their own way. Nationalists wanting to have a referendum whenever and wherever in order to get their own way. So then that's what dominates the debate. Rather than thinking about it, look, what will be fair here? What's the best way to do this? What's the best way to handle it? It tends to be dominated by just factional interest. Now, what's the Scottish Family Party's policy? Our policy is that if there were a clear majority for Scottish independence in opinion polls over a number of years, then that's the time to have an independence referendum. And during that referendum campaign, the Scottish Family Party would not campaign one way or another. And if Scotland became independent, then we would embrace the opportunities that presented, and we would get stuck in trying to create the Scotland that we want to see in the future. We certainly wouldn't be saying, we want to reverse that or turn it back or whatever. We will see how things unfold. So why have I bothered making this video? Well, partly it was just to explain the Scottish Family Party's policy, which I did there. But it's also to try and put the issue in perspective. The Constitution is important. It's a very important political issue. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is it's not healthy for it to dominate politics the way it is and to dominate elections the way that it does. There are other issues that are weightier, and our challenge as the Scottish Family Party is to bring these issues more to people's attention and bring them to the fore of people's political thinking. The politicians in general ignore them, the media tends to ignore them. But if we're going to stop the progressive secular liberal slide, that's just going to continue until people start voting against it. And that can only happen when the constitutional question doesn't utterly dominate the political scene to the exclusion of all else. So on the current trajectory, what's going to happen? Whether Scotland becomes independent or not, is it going to be a healthy, moral and free society? All the indications are no. And we argue that these issues are more important than whether Scotland becomes independent or not. We want to shift the focus away from the Constitution to other matters, such as the value of human life and the well-being of children, etc., etc. Now, I was trying to think of an analogy to illustrate the situation in Scottish politics. I thought of this. See what you think of this one. It's like having a group of people on a coach driving along a road, and at the front of the coach, at the steering wheel, there are two people fighting over the wheel. One person wants to take it off one way, the other person is trying to drag the wheel and take it off the other way. And all the passengers are just obsessed about this thing. They're cheering them on. Half of them want the bus to go that way, half of them wanted to go that way. And they're screaming and shouting and the fight's going on, the bus is wobbling all over the place. But in the meantime, well, this bus might well crash because people are fighting over the steering wheel. They're not properly in control. But maybe the brakes of this bus are completely worn out and they're about to fail completely. And the bus is going to have a terrible accident. Maybe there's some people at the back of that bus who are really, really ill. They need medical attention, but no one's paying attention because they're obsessed with the fight at the front. Now, maybe there's a time bomb ticking down on the back seat of the bus and the whole thing is going to go up in smoke before too long. But all these other issues are ignored. It's the fight over the steering wheel at the front that people are obsessed with. So what needs to happen on that bus? It needs some of the passengers to say, look, oh, hang on, look everyone. There are some more serious issues here we need to deal with. If we just carry on the way we're going, this is not going to end well. And that's what we are as the Scottish Family Party. With these few passengers on the bus saying, hang on, there are some more serious issues here we really need to look at. Okay, thanks for watching.